they've also kind of crystallized that whole morality of theirs of Hakuna Matata into this phrase and into this sort of ideology.
Mhm.
And they are actually actively trying to spread it. And they're like, God, look at all the problems that you have just because you're acknowledging they exist. If you just stop doing that, everything will be fine.
So it's interesting to see all these motifs just in Lion King too, a little bit. Hello there, I'm Josh,
And I'm Callie.
and we're business partners in Studio Pandemonia together, and we make a lot of Oracle decks, as I've demonstrated on my channel. We're currently working on a Oracle deck having to do with monsters, mythic monsters and beasts and aspects of self that haven't been integrated. And we thought we would look at one particular monster archetype today, actually three. They're like the vices, the three vices to each virtue.
So the Nemesis Oracle follows after our work with the Gift of Virtue and introduces the 12 cardinal virtues, of which today we're going to talk about loyalty.
Loyalty is the virtue of Leo.
And so the framework for Nemesis is that we took a concept from the Enneagram or human design, where we look at an excess, a lack, and a misuse of the various virtues and how that leads to corruption. And we're also looking a little bit at the biomes that inspire kind of where these monsters tend to live, where they haunt, and how that impacts the path of corruption and the degradation of the virtue that we looked at previously.
Mm.
And so the first one that we're going to look at is the desert. So, Josh,
Mhm.
from your geography background, we introduced a little bit of these concepts also when we talked about the staple crops, values and virtues that erupt from different types of biomes and different challenges that different environments pose to people who cultivate and settle there.
In studying mythology and culture, I think being in a desert, it's desolate. And there's often this focus on like the oasis, the paradise, the bits of the natural world, this inhospitable place to live that are incredibly hospitable. And that often, Garden of Babylon, so to speak, civilization has to build up its own kind of paradise. So, desert is kind of a biome that requires a culture to adapt, in which case they have to have a very hardy lifestyle of preserving water and usually travel and trade is important as well between different sites, different oases. Yeah, loyalty is important in the desert because there's only a minimum amount of resources. It's limited. There's scarcity, and so you have to be very careful about who you let into your loop. Who's not going to waste resources? Who's not going to take something and leave? You want everybody to be accountable.
We've talked a little bit about temperature and the humors and kind of this Renaissance alchemical view of the elements. And so, this hot, harsh, dry kind of environment creates a certain mentality of scarcity. Specifically, in lacking water, it's lacking empathy. And so, the balm for that, or sort of the way that people have adapted to deal with a lack of empathy, is through this kind of more fiery virtue of loyalty, where the emotionality doesn't really need to be present because everything is kind of lacking water that's scarce, but through fierce loyalty you can kind of overcome that shortage. And you see that in literature and things like Dune, right, where water is such a prized possession, and water is kind of regarded to be this shared resource of the tribe. And when you die and you give your body back to the tribe, you're giving back your water, and it's recycled, and everything is kind of kept. And so, in talking about these desert religions or desert cultures, like Josh introduced, there's a lot of that communal morality that forms around these fierce, tribal family ties. When I was playing with the desert in my animations, there was a lot of like dark and light that comes into play in the desert. It's a place of very like strong, stark shadows. You have, very stark overhead lighting. Yeah.
Cold at night, hot in the day, right?
Yeah. Yes. Yes. The cold is also, it's all very
Extreme.
dry and it's all very extreme. So, one little bit that we wanted to play with and introduce is this concept of wounding, as far as, what is the nature of the corruption for each of these signs, like what kind of drives them from their virtue, what's the thing that is sort of this catalyst. Exploring the wound of loyalty is scarcity. In looking at the symbol that kind of goes with that, we came up with the thorn. And so the kind of archetypal story of the thorn to me that relates to this, and what kind of visually starts to relate to some of the monsters we're about to introduce, is the story of the mouse and the lion, where, one day the mouse comes upon a lion who has a thorn in its foot, and the lion is very fierce and menacing and threatening. And the mouse overcomes this fear and goes and takes the thorn out of the lion's paw anyway. The brief moment where they're close together, the lion could retaliate and kill the mouse, but he eventually chooses not to. And later on in the future, it turns out that the lion is able to return this favor of loyalty in a way, by protecting the mouse when he is in a similar tight spot. And so this thorn, I think, is very characteristic of this wound of scarcity, because it is tied to feelings of fear and anxiety. It's not really a huge game ending wound, right? It's something that's kind of more lingering. It's something that's pervasive. It's just something that's kind of nagging in the back of your mind. And when, there's this question of loyalty in a story of like a king or something who's worried that there's these assassins out there, it's always daggers and poison and knives. It's not necessarily like somebody's coming in with a broadsword and they're going to cut off their head, right? It's kind of these more subtle things and more hidden. And so I think the thorn is kind of a good symbol for that whole phenomenon, because it's like the thorn in your side. It's like the thing that you just can't get out, that you can't go away. The redemption of that and the balm for that is the voluntary removal and the trust and the loyalty that's formed, when somebody kind of overcomes that.
Trust is like what we give and then what we get. It's the resource in a way of loyalty.
It's the currency that we use to overcome lack of resources in the physical environment. When you don't have physical resources, you can come up with social resources, which, of course, Leo being the love sign and having this cardinal virtue of loyalty is what it's seeking to adapt and do. Because by generating this wealth through social connection and cooperation, you can kind of overcome and make better use of resources when they are scarce through higher cooperation and generosity and things like that.
The whole is greater than the sum of its parts, right?
Yeah. The thorn, as a symbol, moves us into introduction of the first of the beasts, which is the corrupting force when the thorn is not removed, right? What is allowed to fester, what has become. And so the first of the monsters, I will have Josh introduce as I hold up the art for it. And I wanted to make mention of it. We try to do a different art style kind of for every deck that we do. We really push ourselves and try to explore new ways of presenting and expressing. And in this project, actually, we're tag teaming, and I went back to a traditional art style for a portion of it, and then Josh is doing the digital coloring. So this is our first truly collaborative project since Gift of Virtue, and very much represents a fusion of our styles. So the images that I'm going to be presenting are just the graphite shaded bones, I guess you would say, which the color is applied
filled in
to.
later with all kinds of pretty colors.
Yes, Josh is very concerned with color.
So I think the one we wanted to start with, kind of, you mentioned the king and that kind of paranoia. We would want to start with the Chimera. And really, there's a lot of versions of the Chimera in mythology. There's the Manticore, the Rakasha, the Simurgh, Azazu, and Shushu, even a Sphinx to some degree.
Just things that are combining the predatory, feline, apex predator qualities of like the lion, or sometimes a jaguar or something like that. Often those characteristics are combined or corrupted, and so the thorn in the case of the manticore or scorpicore or something like that is this venomous tail that follows behind. In our version, we went with a more traditional chimera, where it does actually have the king cobra as his tail. So he's kind of like the lion king symbol, and then also the king cobra. And ours does actually also have the antelope cloven feet to get in kind of like a devilish Baphomet thing.
But metaphorically, the snake essentially represents an archetype that's in a lot of stories, which is there's Mufasa and then there's Scar. and really Scar, and this idea of the advisor, the cunning, crafty thorn in the side, the
The
stab in the
vizier.
back, the vizier, right? So
Mhm.
it's interesting to have those two in one monster, really representing. It's almost like the snake is his subconscious fear of being usurped, and it's constantly thinking about how to out scheme everyone else to stay in power. And in general, the idea of a chimera is taking in all the best features of every animal to try to become the most dominant apex predator animal, to be the king of kings, to be the greatest of all. Usually, people in power, or who are at least in some place of power. It could be a corporate executive just as much as a king or actual emperor in history, right? And it could be a family member. It could be somebody who thinks they have power over the family.
Right. So to circle back, we have on these cards we're going to have like the main vice word also, or like the sin you could think of. And so for the excess, this is the excess
Mm-hmm.
of loyalty, right? If it goes to the
Mm-hmm.
extreme, there's actually a point where it becomes too much, and so that would be the sin of pride.
Mm-hmm.
And so that has to do with the overinflation of the ego and with the self-centeredness and obsession. The Lion King, as Josh mentioned earlier, is a great example of this, where when you centralize too much and you invest too much in one ego presentation, then you are perhaps ignorant of the shadows lurking that do covet that and also seek that sort of centralized power. You know, instead of truly delegating the power and sharing it and empowering the people around you. You know, when you take too much on yourself, when you form this kind of composite beast, you know, and you've got this snake's tail, which represents like fear, the axis of fear, and anger is of a fiery nature, right? And it represents the amygdala and the panic response and this constant vigilant anxiety that is keeping you from cultivating an authentic ego
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't need all of this narcissistic safeguarding right
Yeah.
through.
And a factor of narcissism is the externalization of validation. And that's an interesting aspect of this chimera, as well as being one extreme of loyalty. Because a form of loyalty is it is not loyal to anything or anyone, right? The chimera is not extremely loyal. That's not what the excess is. The excess is the extreme need for loyalty, others to be loyal to oneself. Eventually, if you have that need and it's so severe, really you're struggling with a lack of true actual security in yourself. You
Mhm.
do require other people to be afraid of you or to bow down to you, be loyal to you in order to feel like you're enough, like you're valid. And so that externalization, validation.
It's interesting also, the wings uh,
Mm,
being kind of this opposite. You know, the winged lion is often a symbol of liberation and security and freedom, uh, and so this is kind of like the fallen winged lion in a way. So that is pride. So shall we? Moving on
mhm,
to the absence of loyalty.
Yeah, the opposite of that external loyalty, the lack of loyalty, is the Wishmaster, the genie, the jinn.
Another classic desert monster. We did also really try to go through mythology of the whole world as much as
Hmm.
possible, drawing from all of our combined knowledge of monsters,
Hmm.
which were super nerdy, so that's pretty extensive. And we tried to go through and find the most common themes, and particularly ones that we found evidence of in multiple cultures, or there were sort of verifications, were ones that were strong enough to put to these concepts. So there is this sort of wishmaster in many different cultures,
Hmm.
but the the sort of wispy, sandy, deserty one is kind of fun. And it represents treachery. So the lack of loyalty, the absence of loyalty, is this facade that the genie puts up, you know, of being
Hmm.
this people pleaser who is granting every wish, who is doing the whims of the master, and adopting this slave morality. And this turns out to be a very corrupting force because, of course, in order to do this, they have to abandon their sense of self and their self loyalty and preservation and kind of put on this show. And it's all an act, right? They're feigning this vulnerability in exchange for, in the case of like the Aladdin story, great power, because the trade-off cosmically is supposed to be that the genie has this incredible power to bend the rules of nature, but within the parameters of these three wishes and all of their rules and limitations, and that they're on behalf of someone else, right? They're not able to control their own life. But what the genie truly wants is freedom and autonomy. And so they, through their corruption and guile, get to the point where they harbor this resentment and seek to kill or overthrow the master so that they can finally be free. And so Josh had some good points about the redemptive quality of the genie in the Aladdin story, at least the Disney version.
The redemption arc of the genie in that story is essentially he goes from being, in a way, cynical and selfish and kind of hedonism,
Mm.
essentially. This he enjoys just the act of making wishes and just messing around, and you never had a friend like me. Of course, it's all external validation that he's trying to get other people to. Wishmaster wants to provide all the wishes for the egotist and supply them right with granted wishes, and then the egotist, the narcissist, gets to and have all their wishes fulfilled externally. That is because, and even the genie from the movie before his character arc, where he grows to actually like his master and care for his master and wish that his actual authentic wishes are met, his ultimate needs are actually met. In the beginning, he, like many genies, kind of looks at everybody like they're just another narcissist. Like they're just asking for more external validation, and that's what they dish out. He has a bunch of suggestions right away. It's like, what do you want to do? You want to wish for power, women? What do you want? I've been through the works, and he's become cynical, and he like embraces that cynical reality that he thinks exists, that everyone's selfish, everyone is a jerk, and that no one can really ever have what they want as well. There's a cynicism there too of like, people can't be happy, people can't have what they want because he's seen it. He's seen that absolute power corrupts absolutely in so many cases, right? But
Mm.
that's also an issue because as a genie with the power to actually make things happen, if you're a cynical genie, then you are intentionally making things not happen. You're kind of putting a little joke in there. A lot of the mythology that shows the Wishmaster, there's usually like it's almost like he knows what he's doing. He's almost teaching a lesson because someone will ask for a bunch of money, or I guess with King Midas, right?
Mhm.
He'll ask to turn everything to gold, and he's like, "Well, you're gonna literally turn everything to gold, then." And then he
Mm.
does, and he loses his family and everything, turns them to gold, and it's like, oh, haha, caveat.
Well, just the whole be careful what you wish for
Yes.
motif, and
Mhm.
lesson is really interesting. It's also really interesting that true love is specifically off the table. I think that's like a big
Mm.
hint about the nature of this whole wound, because of course, Leo being this love sign and loyalty having to
Mhm.
do with like wanting it to be real, wanting it to be because you value them, not just what you're getting from them. So yeah, the Wishmaster, the
Mhm.
treachery is sort of like the extreme end of that, where it's like everything is transactional, everything is very
Mhm.
cutthroat, and it speaks to that kind of scarcity wound where it's like you can't get what you want through your own virtue or through your own work, so you have to take this shortcut. And so the genie is kind of the warning about taking shortcuts, and that ultimately there's a cost, everything has a cost.
Mhm.
And not only that, but there's such an extremity to it with these stories where it's like, you need a mountain of gold, nothing is enough.
Mhm.
It's this very extreme version of it. It's not just like, oh, I'd like enough to live on, I'd like a little shack somewhere. It's like, no, I need a palace, I need to be king. So it
Mhm.
creates this extremity and this very stark hierarchy.
Then you got more money, more problems,
Yep.
as they say.
Yeah, and just the establishment of hierarchy kind of forces this dynamic to
Mm.
persevere. And so another early example, I guess, is the League of Legends example of Xerath. Even if there is some virtue or integrity, or Azir wanted to free him, that was his ultimate intention. They were childhood friends, and but there were just all these excuses through politics or pressure. He wasn't able to free all the slaves until he made this other move, and by then it was too late because the corrupting force for Zareth of being a slave, even though he did have this genuine friendship with Azir and cultivate that his whole life, ultimately the hierarchy and the rules that had been established for them drove him to this uh, need for ultimate power, in order to gain his freedom. So he's a good example of a wishmaster or genie too. Yeah, because he experiences ascension
Mhm.
and does as well. And so like he gains that genie like cosmic power because he feels that's what he's entitled to or he needs in order to escape his life of slavery. But by the end of it, his full corruption is that like he isn't trying to get him and all of the other slaves freed at that point. He only cares about himself. So he was become the narcissist. He'd become fully
Mhm.
self-absorbed in his quest for power and his deep resentment for Azir for not having granted him his freedom beforehand willingly, even though in his heart he had the desire to do so. So there's just like through that, how the desert shapes and cultivates this hierarchical structure and kind of enforces this need for, a king and a
Mhm.
slave. And the duality of that, and how there just really is no
Mhm.
way, even when you do have a pure heart like Aladdin, right? There's just really
Mhm.
no way to bridge that gap through your own virtue when the structure is so rigid and the
Yeah.
scarcity is so
It's
intense.
it reminds me of kind of American capitalism to some degree. How there's this ideology out there that is kind of pushed on poor people that they can be rich people one day if they just work hard enough, right? And there could be plenty of them that do get success, and they're not going to try to fix the system, make it better, make it more fair because they got ahead because they pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, they think. And so yeah, there's
Mhm.
that slave morality of like kind of proving yourself through the master system, and you get the master's tools, and now you're the master, and you decide that you're going to do the same thing the master did to you, right? And you
Right.
just flip the script. And this is how slave morality works, you know. Now, to get back to, I guess, the genie and the wishmaster, yes, it has to do with the idea of what we really want and what we really need, discerning between them. And
Hmm.
the lack of loyalty really means a lack of loyalty to oneself and to what one really truly needs. Is that
Yep.
enough, I think, for the wishmaster?
I think it's pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
So finally, the category of the misuse or the misallocation or just total misunderstanding of the virtue of loyalty is neglect. And this was the first one that I drew of these. We are in Leo season right now. We started these illustrations with Leo, so this is actually the first one, and it's kind of become one of my favorite characters very quickly. This is a very unique monster. This is the questing beast or the Blinkbeast.
Mm-hmm.
And this theme is prevalent in many different cultures. In China, this is the Zhang, and it has uh, kind of thunder, lightning kind of connotations as well, and it has these powers of teleportation. And neglect represents, the oasis and the desire to escape the scarcity through delusion and through leading others astray as well. So the Sphinx kind of fits here pretty squarely
Mm-hmm.
as this questioning, this kind of existential crisis, paralysis kind of motif where you're just pining and wishing for the oasis, and so you create this false mirage of the world, and neglect to cultivate authentic loyalty by just distracting and commanding attention, kind of endlessly questioning.
Then the Blink Beast is like the dude hanging out in that mirage saying doesn't matter because this is because Wonderland is this kind of mirage, this fake, strange place of chaos and messiness. And in some ways, I guess it also attaches to the jungle in Lion King, right? It's this place that you can escape and no worries for the rest of your days.
Just
There's
remain juvenile, eat bugs, never
yeah,
cultivate, never grow up. It's got a
yeah.
little bit
There's
of in there.
it never really fully happens. Simba is almost becoming something of a blink beast in that way because he's avoiding his responsibility. But like he has friends, he has connections. He hasn't completely become cynical and detached. But if he would have been left there long enough, Who knows what kind of bad, cynical
Well, he does
bastard he would
also
have been.
have a corrupting effect because when Nala first gets there, he's trying to
That's right.
convince her of the same. He's trying to kind of spread
Mm-hmm.
his, it's they've also kind of crystallized that whole morality of theirs of Hakuna Matata into this phrase and into this sort of ideology.
Mm-hmm.
And they are actually actively trying to spread it. And they're like, God, look at all the problems that you have just because you're acknowledging they exist. If you just stop
Mm-hmm.
doing that, everything will be fine. So they
Mm-hmm.
do kind of become a cult of sorts, and they become a corrupting force that is trying to lead others astray. And they genuinely believe that they're doing them a favor or doing good.
Mm-hmm.
But it's at the expense of cultivating the real virtue of loyalty that is what they need to transcend
Mm-hmm.
Scar and the wound that was created by his coveting of the throne.
So it's interesting to see all these motifs just in Lion King too, a little bit. The biggest influence and inspiration from where I was standing when we were talking about it was the Cheshire Cat, right? And that's what the Cheshire Cat kind of shows Alice is like appears almost as an advisor, as someone who seems to be helping, and maybe he sends her one direction or another, but he's really kind of just playing with his food in a way. He's just, it's
Mhm.
not even his food at this point. He doesn't care, but like he's just messing around, embracing the chaos.
But at the same time, like as a friend figure, like he is actively practicing neglect. He's
Mm-hmm.
kind of trying to sidetrack and prevent her needs from being met. He does at least kind of like guide her to question what those are, or like as far as the be careful what you wish for question, um, of which, loyalty or virtue is the transcendent answer. Like he does kind of pose questions, but the whole thing I think about like the Sphinx as, the riddle keeper or the questing beast as sort
Mm-hmm.
of this kind of this guard keeper or gatekeeper who is just kind of slowing things up, or sometimes it can be good to stop and think about what we're doing before we just leap into action. But the questing beast kind of represents this perpetual indecision and
Mm-hmm.
the paranoia, kind of the suspicion, kind of the whole like, oh, are these people loyal, who can I trust, without really suggesting an answer, or you know poses this question without really discerning what a test would be. Like, what is the test of loyalty? Because the Cheshire Cat is not actually issuing the test of loyalty to which evidence can be provided, to which there's really a decisive answer that gets you somewhere or moves the plot forward. It's just kind of this endless cycle of questions of like, are you sure? Or, without,
Mm-hmm. Taking a stand.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. In some ways,
Getting to
the
something.
Sphinx is at least a little more decisive than that, because
Mm-hmm.
at least there is an answer to the Sphinx's riddle that gets you to the next stage of the adventure. But maybe a better metaphor for the Sphinx, or a better example, would be then Never Ending Story, where the Sphinx comes up a couple of times through the gates, which are obviously this threshold metaphor. And the first gate is this test of courage and your sense of self worth. It's not really courage like go fight the dragon, but it's much more perhaps self loyalty or internal courage. And the punishment, if you have doubt, is that you will get laser eye zapped by the twin sphinxes, and that's just it. You're fried. But then when they do get to the Southern Oracle, the final test is one of self-reflection, right? Atreyu is challenged to figure out what he really needs. What is he really looking for? Does he even really understand the nature of his question? So in that, like, the Southern Oracle doesn't really provide any closure either, or any real answer, because he had been asking the wrong question to begin with. But
Mm-hmm.
so it's the Sphinx still kind of maintains that not really helpful. They'll
But
tell you you're doing something wrong. They'll tell you to do something else, but they won't tell you what that is.
mm-hmm.
So there's a little bit of that criticality that isn't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily constructive.
Yeah, so, I mean, people might look at that as being something that's virtuous, but I think the interesting thing about these vices, I think, is that they are sometimes seen as virtues, or they're pushed as virtues by unvirtuous people or systems. Like obviously excessive loyalty is pushed very actively by something like a chimera or a tyrant. This sort of form of apathetic neglect, this way of, oh, I'm going to neglect you, that's how I'm going to teach you. I'm going to like
Right.
make you figure it out yourself. That's the way that we should be parenting. You know, like that is a thing that's thrown around. Just let them figure it out. And that is neglect, and that's not actually enough. Like, sure, you shouldn't be completely, you know, chimeraing your children, so to speak, right? Just like being everywhere and all places, trying to do everything for them, or trying to, overpower them into being loyal to you and becoming just like you. You know, that's an excess. And then the Wishmaster is what they're spoiling their kids. They're just letting their kid have anything they want, even though it's not really actually meeting their needs. Like, in a way, parenting is actually a good metaphor for this that I didn't even think about. But kind of parenting shows off our own psychological issues and projects it onto our kids, right? That's
And in some ways, the just in this system that we have been working on developing, and just in this pattern, as far as the excess and the lack, those are very obvious. And the misuse is actually kind of the more difficult one to pin
mm-hmm,
or to place. But I guess one clarification I could offer is that the misuse is the active resistance to the cultivation of the virtue, or sort of like defiance of the virtue itself.
mm,
And so the way that neglect works to do that is by saying, it's your own fault. You shouldn't trust anybody. See, trust is the problem.
mm,
Loyalty is the problem. You just shouldn't even try. And so all
mm,
of the monsters that fall into this sort of misuse category, they're a little bit harder to pin down. They've definitely been the more challenging because the excess is very obvious. Sometimes the
mm,
absence is a little harder, but the misuse is very much the confusing
mm-hmm,
one. So that's, I think, part of what drew me to the whole questing beast as well, because I didn't really know much about that original myth from Arthurian legend, and I just think it's such a cool, fun little monster. But the more that we looked for evidence of it, the more we found that this one was actually pretty solid. So it's
yeah,
been a really cool project so far, and we're very much looking forward to doing some more of these little videos to give you a little
mm-hmm,
uh, sneak peek at what the process is like, and also use this kind of as a dialectic process to work through what
mm-hmm,
each of these is and what they mean. And one other thing that's really spicy that we're doing that's kind of a big risk that we've never done before, and we've both been a little bit nervous about, but it's also very exciting, is that in combination with the deck, we're also going to be doing an art book, and
mm,
we are going to be telling these stories and conveying these environments and this sort of world. We're going to be trying to bring that to life as much as possible through an art book that has um, examples of some of these myths and poems, and just collections of like sketches that I've done throughout the years exploring
mm-hmm.
these monsters. Some of these have been really common themes for me throughout my life. So, like, finally bringing them together as a set has been a really fun challenge. How do you feel about the art book?
I think it's pretty fun to try to put our art and our philosophy into something visual, something that can come together as more of a story. Short of like a graphic novel, which I think sometimes are pretty cool because of the visuals. As you said about color, I really like color and I like visuals and visual storytelling.
Yeah. And I think there's something also really liberating about the art book format, because you can kind of distill these really concentrated, intense moments of concentration about that particular monster or theme. Obviously, there's a couple read throughs I think on my channel of poetry. I actually really enjoy poetry, but it's
Mm-hmm.
not really something that we can
Mm,
do, or obviously you can't
mm-hmm.
monetize it. It's sort of just something you do for
Yeah,
passion.
like we can
We
put
just
that in
only
art
have so
book,
much time, yeah, that we can devote
maybe
to
in some of
that.
those
So
visual videos, maybe the
yeah, finally having a home for some of those things is going to be really cool. In any case, so as you can see, Josh really needs a new webcam. And if you feel the same way, you should check out our coffee and our Patreon and consider making a contribution to fund our
hmm,
research efforts. Of course, these are pretty deep digs. This is a pretty intense project. So if you like
mm-hmm,
what we do, be sure to follow both channels. Of course, if you want to be notified of when we're doing these things, we
mm-hmm.
don't have the
Studio
most regular
Pandemonium,
posts
Sapienite.
ever, but we try, and of course, if we got some positive reinforcement about
Mm-hmm,
people enjoying these videos and some interactivity, and if you have examples that you'd like to bring up or thoughts about any of these monsters, please be sure to comment. We'd like to have a whole discussion about it.
mm-hmm.
um, and just explore the concept of sins and wounding and redemption. I think those are all really
Hmm.
important themes. So if you want to get in on the discussion, this is the best way to interact with us here on YouTube.
Yeah, and if you leave a like and subscribe and get the bell freaking notifications, then we might be able to do a stream of this kind of
Yes.
conversation too. That would be really fun because then we can actually answer questions.
Yeah, we had been toying with the idea of a stream format. We're still playing with that
Hmm.
and trying to figure out what that would be. We are also going to be running an experiment next month of stream that you'll be able to interact with, which focuses on our business. There's more info about that on our website, studiopandemonia.com, and all sorts of other cool, nifty little things. We
Hmm.
put a lot of work into that, so check it out.
Thanks for watching our video, and we'll see you next time with I guess you'll be Virgo next, right?
Yes.
Virgo season, September.
Mm-hmm.
See you then. Bye.